There is a silent frustration that many people carry but rarely name. You do the work. You learn, you visualize, you try to stay positive. You even believe you are aligned. Yet prosperity seems to stall at the same invisible point. It feels as if life keeps circling the same financial patterns, the same limitations, the same ceilings, no matter how much awareness you think you have developed. This experience is not a lack of effort, intelligence, or spiritual practice. It is the subtle sensation of being held back by something you cannot see, something that operates beneath intention and conscious desire. What most people never consider is that prosperity is not blocked by external circumstances alone, nor by the absence of techniques or affirmations. It is blocked when an internal force quietly takes control of your decisions, emotions, and reactions. This force is what Carl Jung described as the shadow, the rejected, suppressed, or unacknowledged parts of the self that continue to operate in the background. When the shadow holds the authority, it does not sabotage loudly. It sabotages through hesitation, self-doubt, emotional avoidance, and patterns that feel familiar rather than expansive. Prosperity, at its core, is not simply about receiving more money or opportunities. It is about becoming capable of sustaining growth without collapsing back into old identities. It requires emotional maturity, internal coherence, and the ability to remain present when responsibility, visibility, and change arise. When the shadow remains unconscious, it shapes your relationship with money, success, and self-worth, often without you realizing it. This video is not about forcing positivity or chasing external validation. It is about revealing the invisible mechanism that keeps you stuck and understanding why prosperity cannot flow when your shadow is in command. Once this mechanism is brought into awareness, the path forward becomes clearer, grounded, and profoundly transformative. When prosperity stalls without an obvious cause, at first the blockage rarely announces itself as fear or resistance. It appears as logic. It sounds reasonable, cautious, even intelligent. You tell yourself that timing is not right, that you need more preparation, that conditions must improve before you move forward. On the surface, these thoughts feel responsible. Beneath them, however, something else is happening. An internal negotiation is taking place between the part of you that longs to expand and the part of you that feels safer remaining within familiar limits. This tension creates a subtle paralysis, one that feels justified rather than emotional. Prosperity begins to stall precisely at this intersection, not because opportunities disappear, but because your internal system hesitates when growth demands a shift in identity. Expansion requires you to occupy more space, carry more responsibility, and tolerate greater uncertainty. For a mind shaped by past experiences of scarcity, criticism, or instability, these demands activate ancient emotional patterns. The body remembers what the mind tries to override. When the body perceives growth as danger, it pulls you back toward what feels predictable, even if predictable means limited. This is how the shadow quietly takes command. It does not scream, it whispers. It influences decisions through emotional tone rather than clear thought. You may notice that when an opportunity arises, your energy subtly drops. Excitement is quickly replaced by doubt, distraction, or fatigue. You rationalize withdrawal by telling yourself you are being realistic, but the underlying signal is avoidance. The shadow protects you from perceived risk by keeping you anchored to what it already knows. Over time, this creates a pattern that feels like fate. You work hard, you make progress, and then something pulls you back. A financial gain is followed by an unexpected loss. Momentum builds and then dissolves. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. From the inside, it feels like a strange inability to hold on to success. This cycle reinforces a narrative that prosperity is temporary or unstable, further strengthening the shadow's influence. What is rarely acknowledged is that prosperity challenges emotional self-concepts more than practical skills. Many people are technically capable of managing abundance, but emotionally unprepared to inhabit it. Prosperity alters how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. It can disrupt family dynamics, social roles, and deeply ingrained beliefs about worth and belonging. If part of you associates success with rejection, envy, or loss of connection, that part will resist growth no matter how much your conscious mind desires it. The shadow often forms during moments when you learned that wanting more came at a cost. Perhaps you were taught that ambition was selfish, that standing out invited criticism, or that money created conflict. These impressions were absorbed long before you had the language to question them. They became emotional reflexes rather than thoughts. As an adult, you may no longer believe these ideas consciously, yet they continue to operate below awareness, shaping your responses in subtle but powerful ways. When prosperity approaches, the nervous system reacts first. Tension appears in the body. Thoughts become scattered. You may procrastinate, overanalyze, or unconsciously create obstacles. None of this feels dramatic. It feels ordinary. That is precisely why it is so effective. The shadow does not need to sabotage loudly. It only needs to steer you toward familiar discomfort, rather than unfamiliar possibility. This dynamic explains why positivity alone fails to create lasting change. When you attempt to override fear with affirmations or optimism, you often intensify the internal split. The part of you that feels threatened becomes more hidden, more resistant. Instead of dissolving, it adapts. It learns to wear the mask of reason, patience, or spiritual maturity. Prosperity remains blocked, not because you lack belief, but because belief without integration cannot override emotional memory. As this pattern continues, frustration deepens. You may begin to question your worth, your discipline, or your alignment. Self-criticism grows, further feeding the shadow. The more you judge yourself for not moving forward, the more tightly the shadow holds its position. It convinces you that staying small is safer than risking failure or exposure. In this way, the blockage becomes self-reinforcing, sustained by misunderstanding rather than intention. Recognizing this process changes the entire conversation around prosperity. It shifts the focus away from external achievement and toward internal authority. Prosperity cannot flow when decisions are driven by avoidance, even when avoidance is disguised as wisdom. Flow requires coherence between desire, emotion, and action. When these elements are misaligned, effort increases but results stagnate. The turning point arrives not through force, but through awareness. When you begin to notice the emotional undercurrent beneath your choices, the shadow loses its invisibility. Patterns that once felt inevitable start to reveal their logic. You see how hesitation appears at specific moments, how comfort is chosen over expansion, how familiarity is mistaken for safety. This recognition does not immediately remove the block, but it restores something essential: agency. Prosperity responds to internal leadership. When the shadow governs, leadership is fragmented. When awareness returns, leadership becomes possible. This chapter is not about condemning the shadow, but about understanding its role in maintaining the status quo. Only by seeing how and why prosperity stalls can the conditions for genuine movement begin to form. Scarcity as an emotional pattern that feels like reality. Scarcity rarely announces itself as a belief. Most of the time it lives as a feeling, a quiet emotional climate that shapes how you interpret the world. It becomes the background noise of your thoughts, so constant that you stop questioning it. Even when circumstances improve, the internal atmosphere remains tense, vigilant, and slightly urgent. This is why prosperity can appear briefly and then dissolve, as if it never truly belonged. The external situation changes, but the internal environment does not. What many people mistake for realism is often an emotional habit formed over years of repetition. Scarcity trains the nervous system to anticipate loss before gain fully arrives. It encourages hypervigilance, constant calculation, and an unconscious expectation that something will go wrong. This expectation influences perception. Opportunities are scanned for risks rather than possibilities. Growth feels heavy instead of expansive. Relief is temporary, quickly replaced by concern about how long it will last. Over time, this emotional pattern becomes familiar. Familiarity brings a sense of control, even when the experience itself is uncomfortable. The mind learns how to navigate scarcity. It knows the rules, the rhythms, and the limits. Prosperity, by contrast, introduces unpredictability. It asks you to trust stability you have not yet learned to feel safe within. For a system conditioned by scarcity, this unfamiliar stability can feel threatening rather than comforting. This is where the shadow deepens its influence. The shadow does not cling to suffering because it enjoys pain, but because it recognizes the territory. Scarcity becomes a known landscape, The body understands how to survive there. When abundance approaches, the internal system searches for something recognizable to anchor itself. If it cannot find familiarity in growth, it may unconsciously recreate familiarity through stress, overspending, conflict, or distraction. The result looks like self-sabotage, but it is closer to emotional homeostasis. Scarcity also carries an identity. It shapes how you see yourself in relation to others. You may define yourself as someone who struggles, someone who works hard but never quite breaks through, someone who must be cautious while others take risks. This identity brings a strange sense of belonging. Letting go of it can feel like losing a part of yourself, even if that part has caused pain. Prosperity challenges not only habits, but stories you have lived inside for years. When scarcity becomes normalized, urgency replaces presence. Decisions are made to relieve pressure rather than build alignment. Short-term comfort becomes more attractive than long-term stability. This is why moments of financial ease can trigger impulsive behavior. The system seeks to release accumulated tension quickly, unaware that this release undermines future security. The relief feels necessary, almost justified, because the body has been holding stress for so long. This pattern is reinforced by emotional memory. Experiences of instability leave traces in the nervous system. Even when those conditions are no longer present, the body reacts as if they might return at any moment. This creates a state of constant preparation, where relaxation feels irresponsible and trust feels naive. Prosperity requires a different internal posture, one that allows ease without immediate suspicion. Without that shift, abundance cannot be held, it can only pass through. The illusion of control plays a powerful role here. Scarcity often convinces you that constant worry is a form of responsibility. You believe that by staying alert, you are protecting yourself. In reality, this vigilance keeps the system locked in survival mode. Prosperity does not thrive in survival mode because survival prioritizes immediate safety over sustainable growth. The shadow maintains this state by framing tension as wisdom and relaxation as danger. As this emotional loop continues, the future becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. Plans are made from fear rather than clarity. Goals feel distant, fragile, or conditional. You may notice a tendency to delay commitment, waiting for certainty that never arrives. Scarcity thrives in this delay. It keeps you oriented toward what might be lost instead of what could be created. What makes this dynamic difficult to recognize is its subtlety. There is no dramatic collapse, only gradual stagnation. Life appears busy, effort remains high, but movement feels circular. Without awareness, it is easy to blame external systems, timing, or circumstances. While these factors play a role, they do not fully explain why the same patterns repeat across different contexts and stages of life. Understanding scarcity as an emotional pattern rather than a factual condition shifts the internal landscape. It reveals that the blockage is not caused by a lack of opportunity, but by a relationship with uncertainty shaped by past experiences. Prosperity asks for a capacity that scarcity never trained, the ability to remain grounded when things are stable, to allow space without filling it with worry, and to tolerate growth without immediately seeking to neutralize it. This chapter does not suggest that scarcity is imaginary or self-inflicted. It acknowledges its reality while exposing how deeply it embeds itself in the emotional body. When scarcity is left unexamined, it becomes the lens through which all progress is filtered. When it is seen clearly, it loses some of its authority. Prosperity begins to feel less like a threat and more like a terrain that can be learned, step by step, without abandoning oneself in the process. The hidden relationship between prosperity, identity, and visibility. Prosperity does not only alter numbers or material conditions, it alters identity. It changes how you are seen, how you are positioned, and how much space you are allowed to occupy in your own life. For this reason, one of the most underestimated forces blocking prosperity is not fear of failure, but fear of being seen differently once success becomes visible. Visibility is rarely neutral. It carries emotional weight, memory, and meaning, shaped by earlier experiences of exposure, judgment, and comparison. For many people, visibility has never felt safe. Being noticed once meant being criticized. Standing out invited correction rather than recognition. Success triggered discomfort in others rather than support. These experiences leave a subtle imprint. Even years later, the nervous system remembers that visibility came with a cost. Prosperity, by its nature, increases visibility. It amplifies presence. When the shadow associates being seen with danger, it quietly works to limit growth before that exposure occurs. This dynamic explains why prosperity often stalls just before a breakthrough. Momentum builds, opportunities align, and then hesitation emerges. Energy diffuses, focus shifts. The internal system begins to seek anonymity again. This retreat does not feel dramatic. It feels like discretion, humility, or patience. Yet beneath those rationalizations lies a protective impulse rooted in past emotional conditioning. The shadow steps in not to punish, but to shield. Identity plays a central role in this process. Every person carries an internal image of who they are allowed to be. This image is shaped early, reinforced by feedback from family, peers, and authority figures. When prosperity threatens to move you beyond that image, tension arises. You may unconsciously question whether you belong in a larger role, whether you are entitled to greater stability, or whether surpassing certain limits will disrupt your sense of belonging. The shadow responds by keeping you aligned with the identity that feels familiar, even if that identity is restrictive. Prosperity also challenges relational dynamics. Growth can change how relationships function. It can create distance, provoke envy, or alter expectations. If part of you fears losing connection by succeeding, that fear becomes a powerful internal regulator. You may downplay achievements, avoid expansion, or unconsciously choose paths that keep you relatable through struggle rather than stability. This is not a lack of ambition. It is a loyalty to emotional bonds formed under different circumstances. Shame often weaves itself into this pattern. Shame does not announce itself as a thought. It appears as contraction. It tightens the body when attention turns toward you. It whispers that being fully visible is dangerous, that standing confidently invites scrutiny. When shame operates in the background, prosperity feels exposing rather than empowering. The shadow then associates success with vulnerability instead of security, prompting subtle withdrawal whenever growth accelerates. This withdrawal can take many forms. Consistency fades. Communication becomes hesitant. Decisions are postponed. The internal narrative shifts toward caution. None of these behaviors appear destructive on their own. In fact, they often appear thoughtful, yet collectively, they slow momentum and reinforce a ceiling that feels self-imposed but unexplained. The shadow maintains this ceiling by equating safety with invisibility. Another layer of this dynamic involves self-permission. Prosperity requires an internal agreement to occupy a larger version of yourself. Without that agreement, external success feels unstable, temporary, or undeserved. You may notice a tendency to minimize achievements or attribute progress to luck rather than capability. This protects you from standing fully in your power, but it also prevents prosperity from integrating into your sense of self. The fear of being misunderstood also plays a role. Visibility invites interpretation, and interpretation can feel threatening when past experiences taught you that others project their expectations onto you. Prosperity can attract assumptions, judgments, or demands that feel intrusive. The shadow responds by limiting growth to preserve autonomy. It convinces you that staying smaller allows you to remain unseen and therefore unburdened. This is where prosperity becomes less about acquisition and more about containment. It is not enough to receive opportunities. You must be able to hold them without fragmentation. Holding requires emotional stability, self-trust, and the ability to remain grounded under attention. When these capacities are underdeveloped, the shadow intervenes to reduce exposure before overwhelm occurs. What makes this pattern difficult to dismantle is its emotional legitimacy. The fears involved are not imaginary. They were formed through real experiences. Yet when left unexamined, they continue to govern present choices. Prosperity cannot stabilize when decisions are shaped by past contexts rather than current realities. The shadow anchors behavior to old meanings, even when those meanings no longer apply. As awareness deepens, the relationship between prosperity and visibility begins to shift. You start to notice how often growth is accompanied by contraction, how success triggers subtle self-censorship, how expansion activates old protective strategies. This recognition does not immediately remove fear, but it clarifies its origin. Fear loses some of its authority when it is understood rather than obeyed automatically. Prosperity, in this light, becomes an invitation to renegotiate identity. It asks whether the version of yourself formed in response to past limitations still deserves control over present possibilities. The shadow resists this question because it threatens continuity. Yet without addressing it, growth remains conditional and fragile. This chapter reveals that prosperity is inseparable from the willingness to be seen without self-erasure. Visibility does not demand performance or perfection, it demands presence. When the shadow no longer equates visibility with danger, prosperity gains room to root itself deeply. Until then, growth remains something approached cautiously, touched briefly, and released before it can fully transform the structure of one's life. Coherence as the foundation. Where prosperity can finally settle, prosperity does not emerge from intensity alone. It emerges from coherence. Coherence is the state in which thoughts, emotions, and actions stop contradicting one another. When coherence is present, movement feels grounded rather than forced. When it is absent, effort multiplies while results remain inconsistent. This distinction explains why some people appear to advance with relative ease, while others exhaust themselves without lasting traction. The difference is not desire, intelligence, or spirituality, but internal alignment. When the shadow governs behavior, coherence fragments. You may think one thing, feel another, and act in a third direction entirely. Conscious intention points toward growth, while emotional memory pulls towards safety. Action becomes a negotiation rather than an expression. This internal division drains energy and destabilizes progress. Prosperity cannot take root in divided ground because it requires continuity over time, not sporadic bursts of motivation. One of the most misunderstood aspects of coherence is that it is not synonymous with positivity. Coherence does not mean feeling confident at all times or eliminating doubt. It means allowing emotional truth to exist without letting it dictate avoidance. When emotions are denied, they do not disappear. They influence behavior indirectly. The shadow thrives in this indirect influence. Coherence weakens the shadow by bringing internal states into conscious relationship with action. Incoherence often reveals itself through patterns that feel frustratingly familiar. You may notice cycles of enthusiasm followed by withdrawal, clarity followed by confusion, commitment followed by delay. These cycles are not random. They reflect shifts between conscious intention and unconscious regulation. When the system becomes overwhelmed by the demands of growth, it defaults to older emotional programs. Prosperity stalls not because the goal is wrong, but because the internal capacity to sustain it has not yet stabilized. This is why prosperity feels fragile when coherence is lacking. Gains feel temporary, conditional, or reversible. You may find yourself waiting for something to go wrong, even in moments of success. That anticipation influences posture, tone, and decision-making. It subtly prepares for loss instead of consolidating progress. Over time, this anticipation becomes self-fulfilling, reinforcing the belief that stability cannot last. Coherence begins to form when awareness replaces reaction. When you start to notice emotional shifts without immediately obeying them, space opens. That space allows for choice. Instead of acting from urgency or fear, you act from clarity. This does not remove discomfort, but it changes your relationship to it. Discomfort becomes a signal rather than a command. Prosperity responds to this shift because it depends on consistent behavior across varying emotional states. Another essential element of coherence is self-trust. Self-trust develops when actions align with values repeatedly, even under pressure. When you follow through, maintain boundaries, and remain present during uncertainty, the nervous system learns that growth does not equal danger. This learning happens gradually, through repetition rather than insight. Each aligned decision strengthens internal stability, reducing the shadow's need to intervene. Incoherence also affects how time is perceived. When internal states conflict, the future feels abstract or distant. Planning becomes either obsessive or avoidant. Coherence restores a sense of continuity, allowing you to relate to the future without tension. Prosperity flourishes in this continuity because it requires patience, sequencing, and the ability to tolerate delayed gratification without self-sabotage. The body plays a crucial role in this process. Coherence is not purely mental, it is somatic. When the body remains tense, shallow breathing and restlessness signal unresolved threat. These signals influence cognition, narrowing perception and increasing reactivity. As coherence increases, the body begins to settle. Decisions feel less rushed. Attention stabilizes. This physiological shift supports prosperity by enabling sustained focus and deliberate action. One of the reasons prosperity is often described as flowing is because coherence creates flow internally first. Flow is not constant excitement, it is rhythmic engagement. It includes effort and rest, challenge and integration. When the shadow dominates, rhythm collapses into extremes. Coherence restores balance, allowing momentum to build without burnout. Prosperity thrives in rhythm, not intensity. As coherence strengthens, identity naturally adjusts. You begin to inhabit a version of yourself that feels congruent with growth. This does not require dramatic transformation. It unfolds through accumulated alignment. Over time, you notice that decisions feel simpler, not easier but clearer. Internal resistance decreases, not because fear disappears, but because fear no longer governs outcomes. The relationship with uncertainty also changes. Instead of interpreting uncertainty as threat, it becomes part of expansion. Prosperity inherently involves uncertainty because growth extends beyond known limits. Coherence allows you to remain present within that uncertainty without collapsing into old patterns. This presence is what enables prosperity to stabilize rather than fluctuate. This chapter marks a subtle but profound shift in the narrative. Prosperity is no longer something to chase or unlock. It becomes something that emerges naturally when internal systems stop competing. When the shadow no longer operates in isolation, its protective role can soften. It no longer needs to sabotage growth, because growth no longer feels like self-betrayal. Coherence does not eliminate challenge. It transforms how challenge is met. With coherence, setbacks inform rather than define. Progress consolidates instead of resetting. Prosperity, in this context, is not an event, but a condition that can be sustained. When internal alignment becomes the foundation, prosperity finally finds a place to settle, not temporarily, but with depth and continuity. When prosperity stops being a struggle and becomes a state, prosperity was never meant to be chased through force, repetition, or emotional suppression. Throughout this journey, one truth has slowly revealed itself beneath every layer explored. Prosperity does not fail because you are incapable, unworthy, or misaligned with life. It fails to stabilize when an unseen authority governs your inner world. When the shadow operates without awareness, it does not block growth violently. It blocks it subtly, through hesitation, emotional contraction, and loyalty to identities shaped by past limitations. What becomes clear is that prosperity is not an external reward granted to those who think correctly or believe strongly enough. It is a reflection of internal leadership. When your inner system is fragmented, success feels temporary and fragile. When coherence begins to form, stability no longer feels threatening. Growth stops triggering retreat. Visibility stops activating shame. Responsibility stops feeling like punishment. Prosperity stops being something you touch briefly and lose, and starts becoming something you can inhabit. This process does not demand perfection, constant confidence, or emotional denial. It requires honesty. It asks for a willingness to see how old emotional patterns, once protective, now quietly dictate outcomes. The shadow does not need to be destroyed or overcome. It needs to be brought into relationship with awareness. When that happens, its grip loosens. What once sabotaged begins to integrate. Prosperity, in its deepest sense, is the capacity to remain present while life expands. It is the ability to hold more without abandoning yourself. It is the quiet confidence that growth does not erase who you are, but refines it. When internal coherence replaces internal conflict, the struggle softens. Movement becomes steadier. Decisions feel aligned rather than reactive. At that point, prosperity no longer depends on external validation or constant effort. It becomes a natural consequence of alignment between your inner world and your outer actions. The invisible blockage dissolves not through force, but through clarity, and clarity once established cannot be undone. After everything you have just heard, there is one question worth sitting with honestly. What part of you has been quietly deciding your limits while you believed you were choosing your future? If this message resonated with something deeper inside you, consider subscribing to this channel. More conversations like this are waiting, each one designed to explore the inner mechanics that shape reality far beyond surface-level motivation. And if you feel called to continue this journey right now, stay with us and watch the next video appearing on the final screen. What comes next builds directly on what you have just discovered.